My name is Ava Morgan, and for as long as I can remember, I have lived like a ghost in my own home. Nights at the dinner table were the same routine of voices overlapping while mine dissolved into the clatter of plates. My parents spoke of work, of my brother's grades, of my sister's new clothes, never once pausing to notice the silence that wrapped itself around me like a second skin. I would sit there, fork in hand, pretending to eat, pretending their laughter didn't sound like a door I could never open. Every smile they shared with each other was another brick in the wall that separated me from them. I learned to keep my face still, to nod when expected, and to swallow the lump in my throat before it betrayed me. When the dishes were cleared and the television hummed to life, I slipped away to my room where no one ever knocked. The faint yellow of my desk lamp became the only warmth I knew. In that quiet, I poured myself into notebooks, each page an escape route, each line a promise that I would not stay invisible forever. I wrote down numbers I barely understood, interest rates, savings plans, business ideas, copying terms from library books and late-night websites, like a code breaker in her own house. They thought I was wasting time online, scrolling through meaningless chatter, but every sleepless night was a brick I laid in the foundation of a life they would never see coming. Birthdays came and went like passing clouds. One year they forgot entirely, offering a hurried apology only when a neighbor mentioned it. Another year, they left for a family dinner without inviting me, claiming they thought I was busy. Their excuses hardened something inside me. I stopped waiting for gifts or even kind words. I started waiting for results, my own. Every careless oversight, every unspoken slight became fuel. While they measured love in hugs and laughter, I began to measure worth in determination and quiet action. Sometimes I watched them from the hallway, their faces lit by the television, and wondered what made me so easy to overlook. I was the same blood, the same last name, yet I felt like a tenant paying rent in a house I could never own. The unfairness used to sting, but slowly it transformed into resolve. If they would not see me as a daughter, I would make sure the world saw me as something they could never ignore. That night, as the house settled into the comfortable rhythm of their indifference, I pressed my pen to the page and wrote a single sentence that would guide every choice from then on. They will remember my name. The ink bled a little, dark and permanent, a small rebellion against the silence. They didn't know it yet, but the quietest one at the table was already preparing to own the very world that had turned its back on her. While my family slept in the comfort of their unquestioned lives, I built a different kind of home, one made of plans, numbers, and the quiet hum of possibility. Every night, when the hallway lights clicked off and the house fell into its usual silence, I opened my laptop like a secret door. The glow of the screen became my companion, a small universe where I finally mattered. I searched for words I barely knew how to pronounce: compound interest, equity, investment portfolios. At first, they looked like a foreign language, but each definition I uncovered felt like a key turning inside a lock. I scribbled notes into the same battered notebook that held my late-night vows, filling page after page with calculations, diagrams, and how-formed business ideas that no one in my family would ever bother to ask about. They thought I was wasting time, probably chatting with friends or scrolling through meaningless gossip. My mother would occasionally knock on my door just to say, "Don't stay up too late, you'll ruin your eyes," never once asking what I was working on. I smiled and nodded, letting her believe I was simply distracted by some harmless hobby. In truth, I was building something far more dangerous to their comfortable view of me. Every rejection letter I read online from people who failed, every late-night finance podcast I listened to sharpened my understanding of the game I was preparing to play. It wasn't easy. Banks demanded collateral I didn't have. Scholarships slipped through my fingers. I worked small, forgettable jobs, filing papers in dusty offices, serving coffee to strangers, saving every single coin. I hid my earnings in a plain envelope inside an old shoebox beneath my bed. While my siblings spent their allowances on new clothes or late-night outings, I counted my cash in careful silence. Every bill a small act of defiance. Some nights I doubted myself, staring at the blinking cursor on my screen, wondering if all this effort would ever matter. But then I'd remember the hollow sound of my family's laughter, the empty space they left for me at the table, and the doubt hardened into resolve. One winter evening, after weeks of studying interest rates, I stumbled upon a small online trading platform. The minimum deposit was tiny, barely the price of a family dinner. My heart pounded as I entered my details, double-checking each number before pressing confirm. The screen flickered and displayed a single word: approved. It was the smallest step, almost laughable in its scale, but it felt monumental. For the first time, my future wasn't a dream trapped in ink and paper. It was a living, breathing investment. I shut my laptop and stared at the dark room, my face reflected faintly in the blank screen. No applause, no congratulations, just the quiet heartbeat of possibility. They would never know that while they slept, the girl they dismissed had just planted the first seed of an empire. And I intended to water it until the world and my family had no choice but to notice. The thrill of that first small investment carried me for weeks, but reality is rarely kind to beginners. My early trades were clumsy, full of missteps that left my savings bruised. Some nights I stared at the numbers on the screen and felt the familiar chill of invisibility creeping back in. Banks rejected my applications for larger accounts. Loan officers smiled politely before sliding my paperwork back across the desk. Not enough collateral, they would say, or come back when you have a guarantor. Their voices were soft, but their meaning was sharp. Someone like me wasn't supposed to dream this big. Each rejection stung, but I refused to let it bleed me dry. I took extra shifts at the cafe, wiped down tables long after closing, and collected every tip with a quiet sense of purpose. My coworkers spent their earnings on weekend escapes. I funneled mine into that same worn shoebox beneath my bed. The weight of those envelopes became a secret comfort. I could feel progress in the heaviness even when no one else could see it. At home, the dismissals were louder. My brother teased me about the long hours, asking if I enjoyed playing entrepreneur while he scrolled through social media. My parents barely looked up from their screens when I came home late. "You'll burn yourself out for nothing," my father muttered once, his eyes never leaving the television. Each word landed like a door slamming shut, but instead of trapping me inside, it pushed me further toward escape. I tried every angle, microloans, community grants, freelance gigs, only to hear the same polite no dressed in different clothes. There were days I walked back from meetings under a sky that felt too wide and unforgiving, my breath clouding in the cold as I wondered if I was just chasing smoke. Yet every setback seemed to spark something stubborn in me. I began to see rejection as a strange kind of education. Each banker who dismissed me taught me what documents I lacked. Each failed application showed me where my numbers were weak. They thought they were closing doors, but they were handing me a blueprint. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly brutal rejection, I ducked into a quiet library to escape the downpour. I wandered through rolls of books until I found myself in the finance section. A thick, unassuming volume on small business strategies caught my eye. Inside were case studies of people who had started with nothing and still managed to build fortunes. I devoured every page, my wet coat dripping onto the floor as I read. The stories weren't glamorous. They were messy, full of late nights, failures, and persistence that bordered on obsession. I saw myself in every line. When I finally stepped back into the rain, I felt something shift. The world hadn't softened, but I had hardened. The doors were still closed, but now I carried the knowledge of where the hinges were weakest. I wasn't waiting for anyone to let me in anymore. I was learning how to build a key. Opportunities rarely arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they slip quietly through an inbox while the rest of the world sleeps. One cold evening, after another double shift at the cafe, I opened my email expecting nothing more than routine spam. Instead, a subject line caught my eye. Financial Literacy Workshop, free intro session. At first, I nearly deleted it, assuming it was a scam. But something in the timing felt like a nudge from the universe. I clicked. The workshop was hosted by a small community center across town, promising practical lessons on saving, investing, and building small businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it was exactly the kind of knowledge I'd been clawing for in the dark. The following Saturday, I arrived at the center clutching a cheap notebook and a heart full of nerves. The room smelled faintly of coffee and whiteboard markers. A handful of strangers sat in folding chairs, each of us carrying invisible stories of struggle. The speaker, a retired banker named Mr. Hale, was nothing like the polished loan officers who had rejected me. His gray suit was slightly wrinkled, and his voice carried the warmth of someone who remembered what it felt like to start from nothing. He spoke about budgeting, compounding, and the power of small, consistent investments. But what struck me most wasn't the numbers. It was the way he looked at us, as if we all belonged in the world of finance, no questions asked. After the session, I lingered as others filed out. Mr. Hale noticed my hesitation and asked what I hoped to achieve. I confessed my dream of financial independence and my string of rejections. He listened carefully, then smiled. He said, "Numbers don't care about who you are. They only care about discipline." He offered to share a list of recommended books and invited me to the advanced seminar the following week. That brief conversation felt like a match striking dry kindling inside me. I spent the next few months attending every class the center offered. Weekends that once passed in lonely silence became filled with lessons on market trends, tax strategies, and risk management. I learned to read balance sheets like stories, each line revealing a character or a turning point. I practiced drafting simple business plans and shared them with Mr. Hale, who critiqued them with the patience I had never known from my own family. Between classes, I worked on registering a small LLC, a legal shell for the investments I intended to grow. The paperwork was intimidating, but each signature felt like a step out of the shadow my family had cast over me. I opened a separate bank account under the company's name, a move that felt almost rebellious. At home, nothing seemed different. My family still ignored my late nights and the quiet hum of my laptop. They didn't know that behind my closed door, I was building a framework for freedom. Each seminar, each signature, each quiet victory was another spark. The fire was small but steady, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it burned bright enough for everyone, even them, to see. Progress began quietly, almost shyly, like a sunrise that no one notices until the room is already bright. My new company account, once a string of zeros and empty promises, started to breathe. The first small profits from my cautious investments arrived as a single, modest deposit, barely enough to buy dinner for two. But to me, it was proof that the system I had built in secret actually worked. I remember staring at the notification on my phone, heart pounding as if I had just discovered a hidden treasure. No one cheered, no one clapped, yet it felt louder than any applause my family had ever offered. The trickle became a steady stream. Every cafe shift, every careful trade, every weekend seminar began to compound in a language my parents would never understand. Where they once measured success in grades or polite approval, I now measured it in interest percentages and balance sheets. Late at night, I cross-checked spreadsheets, watching numbers climb like vines up a wall I was determined to scale. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had mathematics on my side, and numbers never lie. When my savings finally crossed six figures, the weight of it nearly stole my breath. I sat in my small room, knees drawn to my chest, staring at the glowing digits on the screen. Six figures. More money than anyone in my family had ever trusted me with. I laughed out loud, a sound so unfamiliar in that house that I startled myself. It wasn't greed that filled me, it was liberation. Those numbers were proof that the invisible girl they dismissed had carved her own path with nothing but discipline and relentless focus. With the guidance of Mr. Hale, I took my next leap: real estate. We identified a modest but promising property, a rundown duplex on the edge of a growing neighborhood. The price made my stomach flip, but the calculations were sound. I signed the purchase agreement with a steady hand, my pen scratching across the paper like a quiet declaration of independence. The smell of ink and old paper felt like freedom. When the final stamp sealed the deal, I became the legal owner of my first property. No one in my family had any idea. I celebrated alone with a cheap cupcake from the cafe, sitting in my parked car outside the newly purchased building. The walls were cracked, the paint faded, but to me, it gleamed like a palace. I ran my fingertips over the keys and whispered, "This is just the beginning." The air tasted different that night, sharper, cleaner, alive with possibility. Back at home, my parents argued about bills and my siblings scrolled through their phones, oblivious to the empire rising beneath their noses. I slipped quietly into my room, logged into my bank account, and watched the balance update with the property purchase. The numbers didn't just represent money anymore. They represented every overlooked dinner, every forgotten birthday, every silent night. And as I closed my laptop, I knew the numbers would soon speak loud enough for everyone to hear. The call came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, disguised by the hum of everyday life. I was halfway through my cafe shift, wiping down tables as sunlight spilled across the floor, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignored unknown calls, but something about the persistence of the ring made me slide my finger across the screen. "Hello, this is Ava Morgan," I said, expecting a telemarketer. Instead, a calm professional voice introduced herself as a representative from First Dominion Bank, the institution that now held my company account and property deeds. For a heartbeat, I feared something had gone wrong, a missed payment, a glitch in the system, but the woman's next words shifted the air around me. "We're calling to confirm details for the upcoming shareholder meeting. As the primary account holder and listed property owner, we require your signature on several new documents." Her tone was matter-of-fact, yet each phrase landed like a small explosion. Primary account holder, listed property owner. She said it all so casually, as if my name belonged next to those titles, as if it had always belonged there. What she didn't know was that my family had accounts at the very same bank. The properties I now controlled were tied to branches they visited, statements they would eventually receive. The bank was preparing to merge certain records for internal verification, which meant my name would soon appear alongside addresses they recognized. They were about to discover the truth not because I told them, but because the system itself was ready to announce it. I scheduled an appointment for the following week, my voice steady even as my heart hammered in my chest. After hanging up, I stood frozen in the cafe's break room, the mop handle slick in my grasp. It felt surreal. Months of secret effort distilled into a single inevitable moment. The invisible girl had become a headline in a ledger they could not ignore. That evening, I walked past the living room where my parents and siblings sat in their usual glow of screens. I almost wanted to laugh at the irony. While they scrolled through other people's lives, mine was preparing to crash directly into theirs. Later, I overheard my mother mention a strange letter from the bank addressed to me. Probably a credit card offer, she said dismissively, sliding it aside. I said nothing, but inside, I felt the gears of destiny clicking into place. In the quiet of my room, I opened the bank's confirmation email and traced my name with a fingertip. Ava Morgan, primary account holder. The letters looked sharper than ever, each one a silent trumpet. My years of invisibility were about to end not with a dramatic speech, but with the calm precision of a financial statement. Tomorrow, when the mail arrived and the phone began to ring, they would finally have to say the name they had ignored for so long, because the bank would demand it first. The morning of the appointment felt strangely calm, as if the world itself understood that everything was about to change. I dressed in a simple black blazer, my company documents tucked neatly into a leather folder that felt heavier than its contents. The sky outside was a soft gray, neither celebratory nor mournful, just steady, like my resolve. When I entered the polished glass doors of First Dominion Bank, the sense of fresh paper and quiet authority filled the air. For months, this place had been the silent partner in my secret life. Today, it will become the stage for my reveal. My family arrived moments later, summoned by the same bank letter they had dismissed as routine. My mother's eyes darted across the lobby, puzzled by the urgency of the meeting. My father carried the guarded expression he wore when confronted with something he couldn't control. My siblings whispered behind him, their curiosity barely contained. They hadn't asked me why we were all called here, assuming I was just along for the ride as always. For once, I was grateful for their blindness. It gave me one last moment to savor the power of what was about to unfold. The banker, a composed woman in a navy suit, greeted us and led us to a private conference room. Papers were neatly arranged across the table, each one bearing my name in crisp, undeniable print. "Thank you for coming," she began, sliding the documents forward. "Before we proceed with the merger of property accounts, we require confirmation from the primary owner, Miss Ava Morgan." The room fell into a silence so deep it felt physical. My mother's head snapped toward me. My brother blinked as if the words were in a foreign language. My father leaned forward, his brow furrowed, searching for some mistake. But there was none. My name was everywhere. On the property deeds, on the investment records, on the bank's own letterhead. I picked up the pen with steady fingers, signing each page with the same quiet determination that had carried me through endless nights of planning. The sound of the nib against paper echoed like a drumbeat. With every stroke, the girl they had ignored was rewriting the family narrative. No raised voices, no accusations, just ink and facts. Numbers don't lie, and neither did these signatures. When the final document was signed, the banker turned to my parents. "Congratulations," she said politely. "Your daughter now holds full ownership of the properties connected to this account. Any future inquiries will need her authorization." For a long moment, no one spoke. My father finally exhaled, a low sound of disbelief. My mother's eyes softened with something halfway between pride and regret. My siblings looked at me as if seeing a stranger. I stood, gathering my papers, and allowed a small, measured smile. "Thank you for coming," I said, echoing the banker's words. "I thought it was time we all understood where things stand." And with that, I walked out of the room, the keys to my own future jingling softly in my bag. The silence that defined my life was finally broken by my name, my signature, and the quiet power they could no longer ignore.